welcome to this review of my Hi-Tek 725 keyboard. This REDUX review has been fairly highly requested, and especially since I uploaded the Ultimate Mechanical Keyboard typing video, because it has a very unique typing sound that people tend to really like, to which I'll come in a bit. Suffice to say for the moment that the new recording equipment will really help here. It's from 1985, and for quite a while it was the oldest board I owned until I acquired my Acorn Electron from 1984. Even still, it's among my older boards, and it also looks the part because everything about it will seem very outdated and bizarre to anyone not acquainted with keyboards from around this era. The layout is based on that of the IBM Model F XT, which is characterized by 10 F keys on the left, a control button where caps lock should be, an absence of arrow and navigation keys, and a numpad which, by extension, you'll really heavily rely on. There are a few small differences, such as a horizontal enter instead of a vertical one, a smaller enter key on the numpad, and this arrangement is the other way around, but otherwise the two layouts are very closely matched. Basically, when you use one of these or something like it, you'll start to understand why there is a num lock key on it, which for those who don't know what it does, basically toggles between the numpad outputting numbers and nav commands. So if you've always wondered why there are arrows printed on your numpad, that's why. This might sound really confusing to use, but actually it's really not. What I do is I just leave it in navigation mode so I can use it for the arrow keys, and then when I need to type in some numbers, I switch to number mode, input the numbers, and switch right back. I found it helps if you keep it by default to one of the specific modes, because that way you'll never really have to think about what mode it's in. The biggest weakness I found with this system is that the down arrow is on the 2 key rather than on the 5 key, which you would expect if you're used to the more traditional T-shaped navigation layout. Another thing typical of many XT era boards is that they use a lot of stepped keys, which are these little hat-shaped thingies. Basically, the idea behind this was that if you made the hittable area smaller, you wouldn't have to stabilize the keys against off-center key presses, because all the key presses would be at least somewhat centered. It's a bit of a lazy approach to keyboard design, and at the time IBM was heavily criticized for all these stepped keys, which people found looked weird even back in the early 80s. As the XT layout suggests, it also uses the XT protocol, which is a bit strange because by 1985 the more modern PC-AT had already come out. Basically, this means it's not that hard to get working with a modern computer, but it's not as easy as AT or PS2. For XT you need a more specialized converter. The XT protocol didn't support lock lights, so the ones on this board are probably keyboard controlled rather than computer controlled, which probably explains why the light works the wrong way around. It's on when it's off, and vice versa. Even for a board from 1985, it's built exceptionally well. These things can really take a punch. The top case is 6mm thick hard plastic. Yes, it's actually that thick. It has a heavy stainless steel back panel and a thick steel mounting plate. Brass sockets for the screws even, which is excellent, and a massive coiled cable. Big, heavy, spring-loaded flip-out feet. In every way, this thing is built like a juggernaut, and this is reflected in its weight, 1.8 kilos. Honestly, in terms of raw build quality, I say it's better built than the XT Model F, even though that one is considerably heavier, and that's really saying something. At the back you can see a serial number, a bunch of test stamps, and a manufacture date in December of 1985, as well as a sticker showing that it was made in Thailand. One thing it does lack is N-key rollover, which some of NMB's later keyboards did come with, as well as IBM's Model F XT I showed earlier that it competed with. Instead, it has the standard 2-key rollover. The keycaps are also beautiful. They're thick PBT, which unlike the ABS used on most keyboards at the time, doesn't yellow with age, and the legends are high-quality dye sublimation, but as you can see the lettering has started to slightly bleed on some of the keycaps, which can happen over very long periods of time. Even the spacebar is PBT, which is rare because PBT shrinks faster during injection molding, which is why most manufacturers use ABS spacebars instead. NMB, who made this keyboard, were one of the very few manufacturers who made PBT spacebars. The keycaps are also very low profile. Look at how flat these caps in the middle are. And the mount is unique, to say the least. Which brings us to the switches, which are NMB Hi-Tek Series 725 switches. These are called 725 switches because they were a redesign of Hi-Tek's earlier linear switches, which look like this. Well, technically these are stack poles, but it doesn't really matter because they look virtually identical. Anyway, these switches were made to be less tall because the idea was that your keyboard shouldn't be more than 0.725 inches off the top of your desk. This was regulated in some ancient DIN norm, which caused basically everyone to redesign their keyboard switches in the early 80s, including Cherry and Alps, who switched to the familiar MX, and SKCL, SKCM series instead. NMB made a wide variety of these with 1 or 2 eyes, small or big eyes, in many colors and weightings, and in linear, clicky and tactile versions. There's very little rhyme or reason to the color coding they used, but they're an interesting design. The switch basically revolves around 2 contact hands which are bent in such a way that they're forced towards each other, were it not for a vertical crossbar embedded in the slider that keeps them apart. You can see the hands through the mouth of the slider, and as you press it down, it moves out of the way and the hands are allowed to meet, closing a circuit. These are one of the very first varieties of Space Invaders switches made, the one-eyed white linear version. When I found this keyboard at the recycling center, it was originally very dirty, so I washed the keycaps and even the sliders, but unfortunately that made the switches feel extremely scratchy, so I applied some GT85 to lubricate them a bit, and now they're better. The numpad 5 switch was also dead on arrival, but I managed to find a new old stock 2-eyed replacement, and now it's working again. Typical of Space Invaders switches, they feel rather stiff, and it's actually somewhat tiring to type on these for long periods of time, but they do feel kinda nice at the same time. Linear Space Invaders are generally well respected, but like their clicky switches, I consider them pretty nice, but not top tier. There are 2 main problems with Space Invaders switches in my opinion, disregarding their weighting, which may or may not be to your liking. The first is that the lack of a top shell means that the switches are rather exposed to the elements. Because of this, and the fact that the slider is really boxed in and held by the bottom shell on all sides, these switches are not very fond of dirt or dust. It's not quite as bad as Alps switches, but if you're looking for a Space Invaders board, I would definitely recommend looking for a clean one. The second is that although the switches are very easy to open, no desoldering or special tools needed, doing so is definitely at your own peril. These switches are quite fragile in a way. The contact hands jut out and it's easy to damage them when putting the slider back on or when yanking the slider off, which can easily happen just when you try to remove the keycaps. There are many accounts of people damaging their boards this way, and I myself damaged the spacebar switch in this fashion, which took me bleeding ages to correct, and it's still not 100%. Basically, if you can avoid it, and unless you're quite experienced working with these, I would strongly recommend just leaving them the hell alone. Another thing about these switches that deserves mention is that they are by far the most stable switches I've ever seen, and by that I mean that there is virtually no wobble present in them at all. Let's compare that to a board with Cherry MX black switches, which really aren't wobbly switches at all. The difference really is staggering, look at that. This is precisely because the slider has so many contact points with the bottom shell, so it's really held in place very firmly. Although stability doesn't mean it won't bind on off-center key presses, which it will if the switches are dirty, for those of you who really want rock-steady switches, Space Invaders are definitely worth considering. One thing that basically everyone likes about this board though, as I mentioned briefly at the start of the video, is the sound. It's a very unique sound. I've never heard a board quite like it. The thick, low caps, big, highly stabilized sliders, and the extremely dense construction of the board itself gives it its remarkable, really dense sound. I found it sounds almost exactly like wood hitting wood. It's extremely pleasant, and even the spacebar sounds very thick, while most spacebars sound rattly as fuck. But no, not this one. This isn't a spacebar, it's a log, especially as it's about 10 meters long. Overall, the antiquated layout is quite usable with some practice, although the weird placement of the control key and its small hard-to-hit size is very off-pissing during gaming, and when doing a lot of typing, eventually my fingers tend to get a bit tired from the weight of the switches. But really, apart from that, it's a pretty good keyboard with stellar build quality, quite decent switches, and a fairly amazing typing sound. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.